Okay, hi, welcome everyone to today's webinar, a data privacy overview. My name is Jason Q. I'm a managing attorney with the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. The DC Bar Pro Bono Center is really excited to host today's webinar and to have our two presenters, Shania and Kiana from Quarles. Before we start, just a few intro and housekeeping notes for folks joining us live today. A copy of the presentation, the slides of the presentation are available to download on your GoToWebinar dashboard. So please look for an option to download the handout. It's under handouts. Also, for folks joining us live, if you'd like to ask questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to do so. You can type them in using the questions field of the GoToWebinar platform. I will review and moderate and elevate your questions throughout the presentation as is appropriate, given the number of questions that we get and the scope of today's presentation. So please keep your presentations coming. If you're watching a recorded version of the webinar, the handouts are available for you to download as well on the page where you access this presentation. Okay, fantastic. Well, our presenters today are Shania Johnson and Kiana Bajarlu, both data privacy and security attorneys at the law firm Quarles. I'll let them give a more detailed introduction, but I would just like to kick off by thanking them so much for taking the time to speak to us about a range of issues and topics and laws that I think a lot of people are becoming progressively more familiar with and know that are issues that are maybe at the back of their minds, but maybe are feeling a little overwhelmed about really diving into or learning more about. So I'm hoping that today's presentation sets up that conversation. It'll introduce a lot of these concepts. And if people have ongoing questions after the conversation, I'd really welcome them to come back to us at the DC Bar Pro Bono Center to explore the additional resources that we can offer or the various brief advice services that we offer to help continue the conversation and your learning in these areas. With that, I will turn it over to Shania and Kiana. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason. That was an awesome introduction. Really appreciate it. So this presentation we titled A Data Privacy Overview for Small Businesses and Nonprofits. The date is April 11, 2023 at the time of this recording, and it is 12:00 p.m. All right, so I'm just going to tell you all a little bit about our firm prior to getting started. Quarles Brady has been around since about 1892, and they provided legal solutions to a wide range of clients on a national stage. Led today by a dynamic and diverse team of lawyers and business professionals, Quarles is a multidisciplinary AM Law 200 law firm with more than 500 attorneys practicing at the top of the profession in Denver, Chicago, Indianapolis, Madison, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Naples, Phoenix, Tucson, Tampa, San Diego, and of course, Washington, D.C. If you guys are looking for any information on Quarles, you can find that on Facebook at facebook.com/QuarlesandBrady. Quarles.com, twitter.com/QuarlesandBrady, or you could just simply search Quarles and Brady LLP on LinkedIn. Okay, so our team, as you can see, today it's going to be myself, Shania Johnson, and then my colleague, Kiana Bajarlu. All right. So, like I said, my name is Shania Johnson. I'm an associate in the intellectual property group at Quarles & Brady. I focus on a variety of IT transactions and data privacy and security compliance matters. Essentially, my practice focuses on aiding companies in the US and in Europe with data privacy compliance and privacy program remediation. If you ever want to know more, you can just go to quarles.com, type my name in, and my entire everything will pop up for you.
I'm Kiana Bajarlu. I'm also an associate in our IP group. I'm in the Chicago office. So I'm a certified information privacy professional, which means I'm just like a privacy nerd, basically. And I just work on a bunch of different privacy work. Personally, I just love how privacy interacts with all different areas of business and law. So I work with everything from startups to established companies with compliance and privacy.
Okay, so this presentation, the outline of it is going to focus on three major sections. The first is going to be a basic what is privacy law section. That's going to just be an overview of privacy law generally. The second is going to be about consumer privacy. It's going to be a deep dive into consumer privacy, confidential information, and then some of the privacy laws that will affect consumers. From there, we'll focus on privacy and small businesses, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about how privacy laws can generally impact small businesses and potentially nonprofits.
Okay, so before we begin, I just want to go over some basic terminology. I feel like there's, so many buzzwords around with privacy, but just so we're all on the same page to begin with. So privacy is the ability of individuals to exercise control over collection, use, dissemination of their personal information. Security is measures to maintain confidentiality, integrity, availability, access, and authenticity of data. So this basically comes down to a company's obligations. You can't have data privacy without security, and if you have inadequate security, it's going to be a privacy issue. And just keep in mind, security, it's pretty overarching. It can be physical security, like think of paper documents, safeguarding those. And on the other hand, our last point is cybersecurity. So that's data security in the technology and electronic realm.
Yeah. So I just want to follow up on what Kiana just said. That basically security in its simplest terms would be, let's say you were on the phone and you got a customer's credit card number, and you wrote it down on a piece of paper, right? And instead of throwing it out or shredding it or anything like that, you just put it into a file cabinet and you lock the file cabinet. That's a method of security. Where cybersecurity would be on the technology side, you'd be somebody who took the phone number on the computer and then you encrypted it or something so that somebody else couldn't find it. Okay, so this leads us into our talk about consumer privacy. Every single one of the people on this line today has some kind of device, machine, object, even animals or people with the ability to transfer data over a network without requiring human to human or human to computer interaction. If you have Google Home in your house, if you have Alexa, if you have any kind of smart technology in your home that allows you to, that allows your home to automate itself, you have the Internet of Things in your possession, right? So in other words, the Internet of Things just connects things to operate together without needing humans to be present. So the way that your Alexa home can turn on your lights at specifically 11 a.m., it's automated. You don't have to go in the house and turn your lights on or off or anything like that. That's the IoT. The cool thing about the IoT is that every day there's new technologies that can be embedded into the IoT. As you adopt that new technology into your life, new data is created. This data is an opportunity for enterprises and companies to get to know you and what you like through your interactions with these technologies. This data has been valued to be worth more than $214 billion in 2022. So there's a huge array of things that companies can learn about you based on how you use certain things. So for example, let's say I use my cell phone to Google soaps, Dove soaps, right? Somebody, an ad tech company could now say, okay, this person, maybe not me, but this advertising identifier, this cell phone likes Dove soaps, and we should now start marketing Dove soaps to this individual. And me personally, I'm probably going to buy it. So there's money to be made based on the way that I interacted with my device. While we're there, we just want to take a brief pause and do this interactive walkthrough. It's a safety check for your cell phone. So many people have iPhones, but if you have Androids, we definitely have a way to do that as well. But on your iPhone, if you go to your settings and you search for privacy and security, look for it in the menu, you can scroll down to this thing that'll say safety check right here. If you click that, it will automatically run a check on your phone to let you know what's happening with your data through your phone. Android is the same. You go to your settings, you search for security and privacy. It's labeled a little bit differently, or you look for it in the menu, scroll down to app security, and you can run a check on your device. So once you run this safety check, it will tell you something like, this many apps have access to your location. Do you want them to all have access to your location? Yes or no? You can remove the ones you don't want. These people track you as you move from application to application. So if you use Facebook one day and then you use Instagram another day, these apps can trace you or send the metrics back and forth to say, okay, this person checked out this artist one day and then they looked at it again on this day. So now we should be marketing to this person or this advertiser ID, maybe not person, but the ID, that this artist is in their neighborhood or they're in their city and they're coming to perform or things like that. So definitely it's super important. It's super cool because as you see at the top, 73% of the global population admits to not knowing what happens with their data. People are just like, hey, it's free game out there. So I'm going to give you guys just a second to do that if you haven't or if you'd like to.
Okay, so next we'll just go into privacy law generally. So privacy laws are laws that deal with the regulation, storage, usage of certain types of information. So this usually includes personal information, health information, and financial information. And there's no one size fits all approach to privacy. So we have a puzzle on this page. And I just really like it because privacy is a bit like a puzzle. I wish we had like one answer to answer all of your questions, but you really need to know what information you receive, how you receive it, how you use it, who you disclose it with. And I just want to point out that we received several questions relating to HIPAA and telehealth and all that fun stuff, and we can't get into too much detail there. Shania and I are not HIPAA attorneys, so I'm not ignoring the questions we received. They just require a lot more detail than we can get into today. So this presentation is really just an overview of the legal landscape. Next slide, Shania. Oh, perfect. So we also want to go over the different types of information. So this is also just kind of going over the foundation. So personal information, the definition actually varies among laws. So there's not just one definition of personal information. So it typically is any information that can be linked or reasonably linked to an individual. So sometimes we'll have clients say, oh, we don't collect personal information on our website. We don't have transactions or collect payment, but even if you have a contact us page where you collect email, phone number, name, that is personal information. And then there's also sensitive personal information. So this is usually requires a little bit more heightened care. So this definition also varies, but it usually includes social security number, financial account information, precise geolocation, genetic data, data revealing racial or ethnic origin, religious beliefs, mental or physical health condition or diagnosis, sex life or sexual orientation, or citizenship or citizen status. And when looking at sensitive personal information, there's subsets of that. So there's protected health information and financial information. Protected health information, PHI, is individually identifiable health information. So this is usually regulated by HIPAA. And then financial information is non-public financial information. And there's a different subset of laws that apply to financial institutions such as the GLBA, which we'll get into another slide. And then I just want to go over confidential information. We received several questions about this as well. So confidentiality is different than privacy. So confidential information typically, it may or may not include personal information, but it typically consists of proprietary or business information that you want to keep secret or protected. It's more so obligations on a business and not relating to the person. And this usually requires other contractual agreements such as an NDA and includes information such as customer lists, marketing plans, financials, HR files. So just something you want to keep safe. And the way I think about this is just personal information comes down to people, confidential information comes down to the data.
And we just threw a lot of information out there. Jason, are there any questions so far?
Nope, no questions yet in the chat. Thanks.
Perfect, that works. All right, so next I'm going to talk about privacy in the United States. So currently in the United States, which we're kind of known for, there is no comprehensive national privacy law. And some jurisdictions, such as in Europe, for example, they have the GDPR, they have imposed comprehensive privacy laws. The US has taken the position that the FTC Act's prohibition on unfair, deceptive, and fraudulent business practices protects consumers just enough so that they don't have to make one of these comprehensive privacy laws. However, the US does have several sector-specific privacy and data security laws at the federal level, as well as many more privacy laws at the state and local levels. So what does this mean that we don't have a comprehensive national privacy law, right? It means that state to state, in most states, companies can use, share, or sell any data that they collect about you without notifying you that they are doing so. It also means that because there's no national law that standardizes it across the board, if or when a company must notify you if your data is breached or exposed to unauthorized parties, it differs from state to state. Finally, if a company shares your data, including any sensitive information that we just talked about, social security numbers, protected health information, well, maybe not, no, not protected health information, that's HIPAA, but social security numbers, things like that, or your location with third parties like data brokers, people who buy data to sell or to sell to other people, those third parties can further sell it or share it without notifying you because we have no law that standardizes it across the board. Each state is different. They can incorporate in a different state and run away from the laws as of right now. What we do have, however, are many federal laws and not sector-specific laws that Kiana is going to talk about that I think are super important to pay attention to, because although we don't have the comprehensive law, we do have certain laws that are there to protect consumers.
Yeah, so the FTC Act, this applies to pretty much everybody, prohibits unfair and deceptive trade practices. I'll get into that in other slides. And then just to go over an overview, so COPPA imposes certain requirements for websites that know or target children under the age of 13. CAN-SPAM regulates commercial messages, so email and text. So you always see on the bottom of marketing emails, you'll see at the bottom, click here to unsubscribe. That's because of CAN-SPAM. And then also when you text stop, they're required to stop texting you. And then the TCPA, which is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, it restricts certain telemarketing practices. So these are just kind of federal laws to keep in mind. So instead of having one law, it's just so segmented. And then looking at sector specific, we have HIPAA, which I'm sure every single person has heard of. It creates standards for protection and disclosure of health information for covered entities, which includes healthcare providers, health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and business associates. And then there's the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. This is one of the financial institution laws, which requires that financial institutions explain their information sharing practices as well as safeguard certain data. And then there's FERPA, which protects the privacy of student education records. And this is not a comprehensive list. This is just some to demonstrate how crazy our privacy laws are. And again, the sector-specific laws are quite nuanced. So this is one of the reasons why we won't be talking about HIPAA super specifically today.
And while we're still on this sort of higher level of generality, can I elevate an audience question? So we mentioned earlier that outside of the US, we have more robust privacy systems like the GDPR in Europe. I remember when GDPR was rolling out, there was a flurry of compliance activity of US entities trying to understand and perhaps comply with GDPR. Someone on the line is saying, I may have customers in the EU, so do I need to know about GDPR? To what extent at a high level do US small businesses and nonprofits need to be aware of what's required over in Europe?
So the good thing about the GDPR is they have a pretty high threshold as to when it applies to US specific entities. I can't remember off the top of my head what the exact number is, but you have to have a ton of customers and data coming over from the EU for it to be applicable to your organization. That's kind of why we didn't go into detail, because normally most people don't hit the threshold of when it's required. So
awesome.
Yeah.
I would also follow up and say that if anyone on the line or listening to the presentation does have a high volume of customers in the EU, that's a good thing to reach out to us via office hours or other services, and we can help navigate whether GDPR applies. But that's been our experience as well, is that most of our clients do not meet the threshold for the European regulations to apply.
And it's a good idea to check, even if you do market or target European citizens, it's a good idea just to check. Check that
Great,
out.
thanks.
Do you want to go to the next slide, Shania?
Sorry, it wasn't clicking. There we go.
There we go. So this is actually my favorite slide. So it just goes over the growth of state privacy legislation. So, we just talked about, we don't have a federal privacy law. So what does that mean? It means that states are kind of taking this into their own hands. So privacy is not new. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures from the government. And then in 1890, there was a Harvard Law Review article about privacy. So it's definitely not new. It's just a really rapid rate at which it's evolving. And you can see here that in 2018, only 2 bills were considered. And then in 2022, there were 59 considered. And even now in the 2023 legislative session, there are 18 bills that are, or 18 states that are still considering a privacy law. And we definitely expect this trend to continue. So it's just crazy growth since 2018 here. Next slide.
Yeah. So of all of these slides, I mean, all of these states that, all these bills that were considered or states that passed or, things like that, only 6 have been passed so far, with the most recent one being Iowa in the middle. And so these state comprehensive privacy laws, we are seeing them, there's only a handful of them so far, but we are seeing them pass piece by piece, and they are all pretty similar, with California being the greatest outlier. California has a ton of consumers living in that state, so of course, they're pretty big on paying attention to consumer privacy and things like that. But some of the concepts that are covered inside of these state comprehensive privacy laws are things like consumer privacy rights. And what does that mean? It means exactly what we talked about before with the IoT, the Internet of Things. It gives you a right to know what businesses are doing with your data. It gives you a right to access the data that they have about you, delete the data they have about you, correct the data they have about you. A host of different things that normally, well, in the past, historically, businesses have not been allowing consumers to do. So that's one of the big things that's a concept inside of these laws. And then the next would be obligations for businesses to follow. So like we said before, state by state, there's not many obligations for businesses, but for example, in California, it will say that if you are processing data of California residents, you have to meet minimum security requirements that California kind of lays out similarly. Most states do that as well. The next would be required disclosures for businesses to make to consumers. For example, you have to tell consumers if you are selling their data. Are you sharing their data? Are you getting any kind of valuable consideration for this data? Because if so, consumers have the right, back to that first prompt, they have the right to say, I don't want you to sell or share my data. I don't want you to do this stuff with my data. I want you to delete it. And then the next thing would be treatment of data belonging to minors. That's kind of on par with HIPAA. It goes a little bit, California's law goes a little bit higher in age, but it's still about minors. And then enforcement and penalties associated with each law are also put out there, just so people, companies, businesses kind of know ahead of time. If I don't do these things, this is what can happen. These are the penalties that can happen. So please note, while these 6 states are the only states with a comprehensive data privacy law, a number of US states have some form of privacy law, like most of them have some form of privacy law focusing on specific business processes such as workplace monitoring, and they have their own statutes covering health data and things like that. Also note, state laws have exceptions, such as not applying to entities that are subject to HIPAA or GLBA, and many state privacy laws exclude nonprofits. Actually, out of these 6 that are on the board, the only one that applies to nonprofits is the Colorado law.
Shania and Kiana, just off of that, a similar concern with GDPR. So for businesses that are doing business online, maybe based in DMV, but operating online across the country, do they have to worry about every one of these laws? Do they need a compliance program in all these states, or is it really about researching kind of what degree of business triggers coverage under these laws and then worrying about it from there? How would you approach that question?
Yeah, so it would definitely be the latter. It would definitely be the latter, in the sense of each of these states also has a threshold. So for example, Virginia, you have to be processing the 100,000 residents to even be considered to have to comply with this law. Go ahead, Kiana. I'm sorry, I didn't, were you about to speak?
Sorry, I was going to say the same thing. So some of them have a number of residence thresholds, some have a monetary threshold. So each one you have to do almost a separate analysis each time to see if you comply. But for example, like I think this is what you're asking, if you are not in a business in California, but you have consumers there, it is likely that you might, or it is possible that you might be subject to California law. So like location doesn't protect you. Yeah, location doesn't protect you from the reach of these laws.
That's true.
Great, thanks. And then another question about these state-specific regimes. How do they interface with the existing federal privacy laws that we have, whether they're sector-specific or non-sector-specific? For example, are we seeing states kind of flesh out HIPAA requirements or add additional requirements in that area? And someone in the audience is asking, wouldn't HIPAA always take precedence in those areas? So I think that's triggering some preemption questions as well. But what's usually the interaction there?
So they all, off the top of my head, I'm fairly certain they all exclude HIPAA and GLBA. So basically if there's a sector that's already regulated, I think the states want to leave it to these federal laws. And yeah, it would be HIPAA that would control there.
Yeah, but also I think what we see oftentimes for the state specific, I think that question kind of focused on like a state specific HIPAA type law. They'll take it a step further in their state law than HIPAA. So HIPAA would be the baseline of compliance, and then sometimes state laws will take it a step further and say, because you are in, let's say Connecticut, for example, and you're processing health data as defined under HIPAA, we're also making it so that you can't X or that you have to do Y. You know what I mean? So it is preemption, and HIPAA will apply, but then if they do come through with another law, it'll just be a step forward.
Got it, thanks. And then last question on the state regimes. Is there a specific reason, do you know, why nonprofits are being generally excluded from these state-specific regimes?
I think it's a lot of the times, at least I was just looking at California, it says applies to a business for profit. So I think it comes down to the monetary threshold in a way. But I don't have a clear, concise answer. That's just at least what I think.
Yeah, I agree with Kiana on that one. I would just speculate and say it's the fact that there's no profit being made, just like we talked about at the beginning with the IoT consumer privacy focuses. It's a $214 billion business, and people aren't allowed to say, don't do this with my data. You know what I mean? So I think with the nonprofits, there's no profit, and there's nothing that I would gain by saying you shouldn't be able to make $1 million off of my data. And I think that's kind of where the states are just that, and that's just speculation. That's just my own personal theory on it. I think they're just focused on the profit portion of it.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of our clients, our nonprofit clients, collect data for non-commercial reasons, right? Because they're service providers, they run programs, they're interfacing with people, and so because there's so many legitimate data collection, non-commercial legitimate data collection practices going on in the sector, it would be really difficult to have folks parse out what's covered and what isn't, and when these requirements are triggered, because they're not built around service providers in that way. That might be another reason. All right, thanks.
Okay, so the next few slides are going to focus on how these privacy laws could relate to you as a small business or a nonprofit owner. So we're going to focus on compliance. We're going to focus on employees in the workplace, vendor contracts, and then tech, website, and cookies. So the first one is going to be privacy compliance. Much of compliance from a data privacy standpoint for many of your small businesses and nonprofits will focus on a proactive approach to data privacy problems. These compliance tasks are not regulated for you, but it's better to be proactive so that if anything happens in the past, you can say, we were proactive in this regard. And if anything ever happens, you know that you'll be safe. So some compliance tasks that we came up with may include identifying where data is located and how it's safeguarded, reviewing and updating your policies related to privacy and IT security measures, and then training people on those new policies, reviewing and updating your contracts with your third-party partners, ensuring all data collected is being used for the specific purpose that it was collected for and removed in accordance with a retention policy. Assessing your data will determine which laws you must comply with. Like Kiana said, you have to look at the data you have to even know if you have to comply with these with these laws. For example, if you're collecting PHI or if your business or nonprofit is directed towards children, there are very specific laws in each state that you would have to comply with that other people may not have to comply with. Opt out of marketing communications. So adding an opt out link at the bottom of marketing emails or telling people how they can opt out, super important for compliance. And then the same with SMS marketing, making sure that if somebody replies stop, you have it automated so that your text numbers will stop texting this person. Next is going to be employees. Though employees in the US generally have a limited expectation of privacy in the workplace, there are some state laws that extend specific privacy protections to employees. So your organization should consider the employee privacy laws in each jurisdiction in which they operate. For example, In New York, for example, if you monitor employees in the workplace, and that could be just cameras to make sure people aren't hurt, you could think it's just to make sure they're not hurt, but technically you're monitoring these employees, right? In New York, you have to conspicuously post that you are monitoring them where employees are being monitored. So you would have to physically post like a paper or something on the wall to let them know that they're being monitored, and you have to have them sign off on the fact that you're monitoring them before you monitor them. So probably at the point of hiring and things like that. That's just one example. But yeah, employee privacy varies state to state. These privacy laws focus on items such as workstation monitoring, email privacy laws, social media privacy laws, biometric information laws, and RFID privacy laws. RFID is my favorite simply because it's new, it's exciting, and people are using it for many different ways. I don't know if you guys have ever seen Black Mirror, but there's an episode where the guy gets a chip put in his hand and he can open up his door and he can open up all these things. So those radio frequency identification technologies can be used for physical access security, and in some cases to monitor employee movement and behaviors. So if, let's say I had that chip in my hand and I was an employee and I badged in and then went somewhere else and badged in again, those are the kind of things that you're watching me, and you know exactly where Shania is at all times, which is kind of interesting. Each state has their own requirements and baseline behaviors that organizations must follow in order to be compliant with their laws on employee privacy. And if you have any employees and you just aren't sure what kind of applies to you, like Jason said, please feel free to reach out at the end of this and somebody can help you.
Okay, so next we'll talk about tech, websites, cookies, just as a whole. So when updating your technology policies, applications, websites, your organization should be extremely specific as to ensure compliance with federal law. So like I said earlier, the FTC Act bars unfair and deceptive acts and practices in or affecting commerce. So this means you need a publicly accessible privacy policy on your website and to adhere to it. So I've been asked before, can I just copy and paste another website? No, don't ask me that. No, because it is unfair and or deceptive. So you might be asking, what is unfair? So the FTC has said that unfair is that when you collect and use personal information without disclosing that you do so, it's unfair to consumers. And then what is deceptive? Deceptive is if you have a privacy policy and it's incorrect or you're not adhering to it, that is deceptive to consumers because you're telling them one thing and doing another. So it should be specific to your website and practices and should be updated frequently, about once a year, to ensure it reflects current practices. And if you're subject to California CCPA, they actually require that it's updated once a year. And just a note, when you update your privacy policies, update the last updated date in the document so you know and that consumers know when it's updated. And this should discuss what information is collected, how it's used, and how it's shared. And you really have to kind of put some thought into it because there's so much information that's passively collected these days. So with cookies, analytics, and other automatically collected data. And then just as a note for you all, the FTC has really, really helpful guidance for businesses. So I put a note there for developers. If you're making an app that collects or shares data, they kind of have a guideline for how to approach this, which I thought was super helpful. And if you go on there, you can even just browse their other topics, but I put that as a starting point for anybody who might have questions about that.
This sort of dovetails with an audience question from earlier, which is, and it gets to the nonprofit small business distinction. Are there distinctions in the applicability of, like, for example, these FTC standards on nonprofits versus small businesses, kind of the same way that we saw with some of the state privacy laws? Do we see these federal agencies, for example, making a distinction?
I think that's a really good question. I've actually never thought about it like that. Kiana, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, but I would just say as a best practice, like everybody should have these policies regardless of enforcement. But that's just me, and I'm biased with privacy. But yeah, I'm not positive actually.
Yeah, we can look into that
approach as well. I'm not aware of any significant exclusions for nonprofits from, for example, these baseline FTC rules. Some of the rules will only apply in situations where you are, providing a service for money or something, but nonprofits do provide services for money in a lot of circumstances. So it's not like a clean-cut distinction between nonprofits and for-profits. So I agree with y'all. Practically, there's not a huge difference.
I think the FTC doesn't cover nonprofits, but aside from enforcement, I wouldn't not recommend having a privacy policy.
Yep, and I just shared in the chat a link to a separate webinar on privacy policies that people can check out if they'd like a little more information in that area.
Thank you. Was there another question?
Nope, that's it for now.
All right, and then the last one that we wanted to focus on was vendor contracts. And these are super important because you all have vendors, you all have vendor contracts, and the vendor contracts are just going to be business contracts between two parties, you and the third party, covering the exchange of goods or services in return for compensation. Your business likely has many contracts, vendor contracts, including vendors who provide services such as food services, internet service providers, marketing partners, things like that. And then many state data privacy laws have reference to vendor contract requirements. These requirements must be drafted directly into your contracts with third-party vendors and usually requires such items such as requiring vendors to have certain levels of privacy and security protections available, and then contractually binding anybody that they hire outside of your relationship to have the same obligations that your business has to the data. As well, this is where confidentiality comes in. So one example that we found, because we think this is super important because data breaches in small businesses are on the rise. 61% of small businesses experienced at least one cyber attack in the past year, and 40% endured 8 or more hours of downtime as a result. And as recently as March of 2023, one of the AT&T vendors experienced a data breach that exposed 9 million customer accounts. So what does this mean? It means that bad actors are no longer targeting AT&T. They're targeting the small businesses that AT&T hires to handle certain things on their behalf. And you can't say these data security obligations belong to AT&T. Like it's your obligation to make sure your stuff is just as secure as AT&T's. So the diligence you do in selecting a vendor is on your organization. You don't want any of your stuff to be out in the open or breached or anything like that simply because you hired a food services vendor who just doesn't have any type of security at all. Like things like that are super important.
So we do have an audience question in that realm. So when we are looking to use a vendor, how do we figure out if they're collecting data, and then how do we sort of assess their data security practices in a way that would reduce liability for our organization just in using that vendor?
Yeah, so these would be contract requirements. These would be things like data sharing agreements. These would be things like requesting to see their policies and practices that they have, their privacy policy. Those kinds of documents, reviewing those documents would be super helpful because, for example, let's say your vendor that you're hiring is an internet service provider. They likely have some form of security policy or IT policy that they reference and that they train their IT people on. You want to check those documents out and make sure that they're at least the minimum kind of requirements that you have going on, or if not better than what you have, is what I would say. You want to check their privacy policy to see, okay, are you guys collecting data? If you're my marketing partner, you're collecting some kind of data. Now, what are you doing with that data? Because I want to make sure that my customers, their data is intact. I want to make sure that you're not doing anything you're not supposed to be doing with this data, because I want to keep everything as compliant as possible with these laws. And just also outside of regulatory, like Kiana said, it's a best practice. If I'm a consumer and I know that when I come to your business, you're protecting my information, you're not just giving out my email and my name to strangers, then I'm more likely to come back to your business and send people to your business. There's nothing worse than getting a phone call from someone you never gave your phone number to.
Sure, thanks. Also on the topic of data breaches, I think this probably opens a whole new can of worms on sort of the compliance side of things. But as a general overview, is there a legal authority that determines what I have to do as a small business owner or nonprofit operator if I do suffer from a data breach in terms of notification and other sort of reparative actions? And then one level down, if I learn that a vendor suffered a data breach, like for example, if I was using AT&T and some of my customers' data were exposed in that data breach. So it's not exactly I wasn't collecting it, but my vendor was. Are business owners or nonprofits liable in that situation when it's sort of like a third party or kind of 1 degree removed from their own data security practices for a data breach?
So
I'll talk about breach towards the end if we want to wait.
Yeah,
Great.
just to, I guess, quickly just say one thing about it. Normally, it would be the state's attorney general that would be handling that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit different, and different states have different laws that center around breach notification, for example. And everything's not a breach just because somebody's stuff got exposed. It's sometimes not. It's not considered a breach under the law's definition of what a breach is. So that's something to really be. First, you gotta call your insurance provider, and then second, you gotta call a lawyer. That's kind of what we've been told, and that's what we're gonna tell you guys. The first call you should be making is to your insurance provider, and the second one after that should be straight to a lawyer, because it could not be a breach based on the definition in the law. But Kiana's gonna go into way more detail on that in the future.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so if we haven't convinced you yet how to care about data privacy, why else do we care? So there's legal risk and then an impact on valuation. So, you know, when looking at the legal risk, we want to look at regulators. So this includes state regulators. For the state privacy laws, this includes the SEC, FTC, which can impose fines, penalties, and injunctions, and as well as putting you at risk of class actions. And then in terms of the valuation impact, this can severely hurt your reputation or help your reputation if you have good practices. And then it just comes down to the bottom line of your business. So, you know, if you want investors to come in and you have all these privacy issues, you're not going to look very appealing. Whereas if, you know, you have great privacy practices, you can, you know, you'll be more attractive as a sophisticated target. Next slide, Shania. Okay, so lastly, we just want to go over insurance and security incidents. So I wasn't originally going to talk about this, but we received a couple questions about this. So insurance coverage may require certain privacy program compliance. So you can use this as a starting place. So if your insurance requires XYZ, of course you should be doing XYZ, and you can use this as a guide. And then in the case of a security incident, there may be several different required actions. There might be nothing. So like Shania said, first call insurance, then call a lawyer. Not every incident is a breach. So, you know, it's kind of a question state by state or whichever law you're looking at. So you need to know what information was breached, usually how many individuals, who you need to notify. So again, this is also like a puzzle too, because there's no answer, what do I do in a breach? And this could also implicate federal law. So HIPAA has its own breach requirements for PHI. Next slide, Shania.
There we go. So we're going to pass it back to Jason just to talk about the DC Bar Pro Bono Center for a second. Just if you guys need any kind of small business advice, or I think they have I know they have a legal clinic. So Jason, I definitely wanted you to talk about that for a second.
Yeah, sure. We've hinted at this throughout the presentation, but at the DC Bar Pro Bono Center, we have a range of brief advice services that can help you get some one-on-one support on the range of topics that we've covered today. So a good place to go, for example, is our small business brief advice legal clinic. This is turning into a hybrid sort of offering. Sometimes it's a virtual clinic and sometimes it can be in person. But this is a regular event that we do where you can sign up for a free one-on-one brief consultation with attorneys, including some attorneys who work in data privacy and related fields, to ask a question specific to your organization. So I would definitely put that on people's radar as a service that they can use. If you're a nonprofit organization, we also have nonprofit office hours where we can talk about some more general questions and issues. You know, it's not staffed by data privacy specialists, so we can't get too in the weeds. But if it's a really high level question, or if it's a question about finding and navigating resources, that's definitely something that we can help with to continue the conversation about these topics. That idea of resources does take me to a number of audience questions that I've been holding, which is we've gotten a lot of questions about, given the sort of state by state nature of some of these regimes, and also just how much of a patchwork it is even at the federal level. Are you aware of any checklists or sort of like one-stop resources that can help people get oriented into what the field is like and whether they should start thinking about compliance with respect to a specific law? I don't, so I was hoping to ask you.
I was going to say, I don't think there's a simple checklist, but I do think the IAPP, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, which Kiana and myself are both members of, their website, which is iapp.org, has a ton of different resources that I would recommend, just looking at. So I would say, of course, start with the state in which you're incorporated or LLC'd or anything like that. Start at that state, just look around, see if there's anything that kind of stands out to you. If anything, come meet out with one of the attorneys at the Advice Legal Clinic or something like that if you do think something may apply to you. But definitely the IAPP's website is going to be a premier source of privacy information and where you should be getting information from.
And also the FTC guidance for small businesses, it's a little more accessible and easy to read and understand. So definitely the FTC website. And when you go on it, there's several tabs. It says for consumers or for businesses. So click on the for business side.
All right, thank you. That's really useful.
And that brings us to the end of our presentation. I do want to thank everyone for coming. If you or your business ever needs help understanding any of these contexts, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Kiana. Our information is on the screen. I'm going to say it out loud for anyone who just maybe isn't watching or maybe listening only. Kiana's phone number is going to be 312-715-2738. She is based out of the Chicago office. My phone number is going to be 202-780-2648, and I'm based out of the Washington, D.C. office. Our emails are going to be our first.last name at Quarles.com, so Kiana.Bajarlu at Quarles.com, and then Shania.Johnson@Quarles.com. And we are around for any extra questions as well.
Thank you. Yeah, let's give folks a few seconds in case there are any last-minute questions from the audience. You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we weren't going to get into too much detail about the sector-specific laws. We did get some questions throughout about the scope of CAN-SPAM, for example, what CAN-SPAM offers, and what how to figure out if you're covered by HIPAA. So those are the kind of specific statutory questions that we did not get into in this presentation. Let's just mark those as follow-up items for people to start seeking their own education and then also reaching out to the legal resources that they have available to them to kind of understand if they're covered. So I will admit that is if you're sort of buzzing and this presentation has triggered questions about those topics, I think that's good because I think awareness is really important and something that we need to continue to develop, but won't be in the scope of what we'll be getting in deep into today.
Yeah, and just to follow up on Jason's perfect analysis, I think it's just the problem with those specific laws is that the answer is that it depends. Every lawyer is probably going to say it depends 5,000 times a day, and with those specific laws, the answer is genuinely it depends. It depends on if the business is doing X, if the business is doing Y, how many people, like it really just depends, which is why we didn't want to get too focused on specific business scenarios and things like that. But Jason wants us back in the future. We don't mind coming back.
For sure. We do have, this is an interesting question. So if your small business, I think this would mostly be relevant for small businesses, is in sort of the business of collecting and selling data or data analytics or selling derivative data, where would we be sort of looking initially at applicable laws and regulations and guidelines for how to conduct that kind of business that has to do with data itself?
I would start with the FTC website for businesses. Just because if you're saying it's a small business that collects and shares data, that kind of scares me initially, but I don't know exactly which laws will apply.
And it depends on, again, it depends on the nature of the data too, right? So there's sort of a spectrum of data that in terms of like sensitivity and in terms of what laws they trigger. So we'd have to dig into that.
Yeah, and it also depends on the number of consumers whose data you're collecting. Like that number, the number of the monetary value that data is associated with through your business, things like that all matter.
Yeah. This is a great question from sort of the nonprofit perspective. So do you have any recommendations on how to go about sharing just contact information when it's sort of like a collaborative environment? So we have multiple nonprofits working on an event or an initiative. For example, one nonprofit is collecting names and email addresses of registrants, and they'd like to share that with the other organizations that are collaborating in this event. Any sort of red flags there? Any best practices? For example, should we maybe disclose that their data, even though they're signing up through one organization, might be shared with other organizations? Any tips for that kind of fact pattern?
Yeah, definitely. Like she said, or like they said, best practices. Best practices would be updating your privacy policy so that when people come to your events or your websites and things like that, they can already check and know that the privacy policy states that we will be sharing this with other partners or individuals who are like us, or that we do events with, things like that. That's always a good step. The next would be, if, like, let's say it's a collaborator that you're not sure what they're doing with it. You really want to make sure that they're doing the correct things with this data. You could do a data sharing agreement. Like you could have an agreement with these entities that says you will only use the data for these things. We will share data back and forth. We will make sure that data is secure. We will make sure that the data is, X, Y, Z, just to make sure. Because again, with nonprofits, I don't want to get too specific in everyone's business needs, but it can, you can be a small business and have a ton of data, and security is super important. So if you want to, you can speak with a lawyer, have them draft you up a data sharing agreement or something like that, and then give it to everyone that you want to share data with, have them sign it. That way, if anything ever happens, you know for a fact that you are secure, your business is secure from a compliance standpoint.
And I also just want to add, if in the process of collecting and sharing information between different entities, it might be B2B data versus B2C data. So the landscape is a little bit less strict in the B2B data. So
can you say what B2B and B2C mean, please?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Can you say what the B2B and B2C means, just in case anyone doesn't?
Yes. So B2B would be business to business data, whereas B2C is business to consumer. Whereas if it's two businesses, you're likely more free to share business information. So another big, it depends.
Yeah, no, that's a great description. Like a lot of these collaborations in the nonprofit space, they're going to be governed by like a memorandum of understanding or some other written agreement anyways. So, you can have a freestanding data sharing agreement, but you can also incorporate some provisions into those other agreements that you're already executing that address data security and sharing is another approach, especially if it's maybe a smaller or more kind of informal project.
I agree wholeheartedly. Those provisions, they could be a paragraph. It doesn't have to be too specific, but having it's better than not having it.
Absolutely. All right, those are all the questions that I'm seeing from the audience right now. So I think folks know how to get in touch. I'd like to thank you both again for joining us today and for opening up this world of data privacy with our small business and nonprofit constituents. This has been really, really interesting and has given us a lot of food for thought. So thank you again for sharing.
Thank you so much for having us, Jason. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, and with that, we will end the webinar. Thank you everyone for logging on or for watching this as a recorded resource. We hope that you'll explore the other resources from the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. If you don't already know, our website is lawhelp.org/DC/NPSB. That's LAWHELP, lawhelp.org/DC/NPSB for nonprofit small business. Hope to see you at another event. Take care. Thanks again, Shania, and thanks again, Kiana.
Bye, everyone.